Welcome back to the deep dive.
Today, we are opening a door onto a world that a century ago was financially broken. We're starting a journey back to the early 1920s.
Right. A moment when the very foundation of commerce, of daily life, it really felt like it was teetering on the edge of complete chaos.
It's a crucial historical juncture. We are stepping right into the ruins of post-war finance.
And you have to imagine the scene, right? The Great War is finally over, but the economic destruction it caused is in many ways only just beginning.
Exactly. You have this perfect storm of debt, these impossible reparations demands, and there's immense political upheaval. And all of it converges to destabilize the one thing every society has to rely on.
Trustworthy money.
Trustworthy money. And across Europe, currencies were just collapsing. This is what ushers in the age of hyperinflation, where the price of bread in the morning is meaningless by the afternoon.
I mean, it really was more than just a financial crisis, wasn't it? It was a crisis of trust.
Absolutely. For generations, really, leading up to 1914, Western society operated on this implicit belief that money was stable, that it was a reliable measure of value.
The gold standard gave you that benchmark.
It gave you that fixed benchmark. The financial rules were understood, but the sheer scale of the war, financed mostly by, printing and borrowing, it just fundamentally shattered that long-standing social and economic contract.
And it's this historical reckoning, this complete breakdown that compels John Maynard Keynes to write the subject of our new series.
That's right, a tract on monetary reform, which he published in 1923.
So this deep dive marks the launch of episode 1 of a 5-part series. We're going to commit to a close, careful reading and a really detailed analysis of this transformative work.
And it's vital, I think, for you to understand. We are not covering the Keynes of the 1930s yet.
Not the Keynes of the general theory.
No, not the Keynes focused on national income and mass unemployment. We're looking at the Keynes of 1923, an economist who is, in real time, struggling to articulate the immediate catastrophic social effects of the monetary instability he's seeing all across the European continent.
So our mission for this first installment is pretty clear. First, we need to introduce the complex figure of Keynes at this very specific moment in time. And we have to revisit this devastating prophecy he'd made just a few years earlier.
And then we're going to conduct a really detailed examination of his diagnosis from Chapter 1 of the tract.
The mechanism itself. How fluctuating money values arbitrarily redistribute wealth, who wins, who loses, and how this whole process, at the end of the day, breaks the social contract that's supposed to hold society together.
It's a fascinating and, frankly, a terrifying story.
Okay, let's unpack the man in the moment. When we talk about Keynes in 1923, we're looking at an incredibly unique figure on the global stage. I mean, he wasn't just some theorist. He was a celebrity.
A global celebrity, and that status was hard-earned. By the early 1920s, Keynes had this incredible reputation from his earlier work. Skidelsky, his biographer, notes that he had secured his claim to attention because he had mastered two seemingly different fields, science, economics, and words.
Right, just a rare combination.
A very rare combination. It made him this incredibly compelling public intellectual. It meant he wasn't just, cloistered in Cambridge. He had the academic rigor, but he also had the literary force to command massive public attention right in the middle of a crisis.
And crucially, he wasn't just watching the chaos from an armchair, was he? He was neck deep in the financial markets himself.
Oh, completely. He had been an active investor and, a bit of a gambler on the stock exchange since 1913. He engaged directly with the City of London.
And what's really relevant to the tract is that during this exact period, he was actively speculating on the very European currencies whose instability he was writing about. He had skin in the game.
He absolutely did. And that hands-on experience gives his writing this unique authority. He occupies this fascinating status as the outsider insider.
What do you mean by that, the outsider insider?
Well, he gained the powerful insider reputation from his wartime service at the Treasury. I mean, he literally saw the mechanisms of state-financed debt, war financing up close. He knew how the sausage was made.
But he was also a rebel.
At the same time, yes, an intellectual rebel, a successful dissident even against, the conservative financial administration at his own college in Cambridge. So he knew exactly what the Treasury was thinking, and he knew exactly how the markets were reacting. He had both perspectives.
So he really had the perfect vantage point to deliver an urgent message. He saw the institutional inertia of the government,
The practical pressures of international finance, and the sort of intellectual rigidity of the classical economic models that was still being taught.
So by 1923, he was described as a preacher who needed a pulpit,
And the Tract was that pulpit. And
Yeah.
he had this urgent double message he needed to deliver.
Okay, what were the two parts?
Well, the first part was international. He argued that Britain needed to secure a sane settlement of reparations to stabilize Europe's economy.
Stop crushing Germany.
Basically. And the second part, which was maybe even more contentious, was domestic. He said Britain must stop the ill-conceived political obsession with returning the pound sterling to its pre-war gold standard parity.
And he saw both of those things, the reparations and the push for gold, as just paths to complete social ruin.
Utter ruin. And the urgency of that message, that almost messianic quality you feel in his writing, it rests entirely on this terrible prediction he'd made 4 years earlier.
Right. And by 1923, it had tragically come true. We have to rewind just a little bit to 1919 and his critique of the Treaty of Versailles, the economic consequences of the peace.
That book is what made him globally famous. And by 1923, he was the vindicated prophet. He had foreseen with just absolute clarity that the punitive reparations demands on Germany, combined with how governments were handling their war debt, would lead to an uncontrollable, socially destructive financial breakdown.
How exactly did he frame that destruction?
Right.
Because it's one of the most powerful and, frankly, chilling warnings in all of economic literature.
It is the definitive warning about how social order dissolves from within. Keynes warned that, and I'm quoting here, "There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency."
You talk about revolution.
He's talking about revolution, social despair, the complete collapse of civil order, all triggered by monetary mismanagement.
When you read that line, it's not just abstract economics. He's saying a government can engage in social destruction without ever firing a shot. How did he describe the mechanism? How does it work?
He described it as this insidious, hidden attack. He wrote that the process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose.
Not one man in a million is able to diagnose. That's the key, isn't it? It's invisible. People see the prices going up at the shop, but they don't understand the complex interplay of central banking, of debt, the money supply that's causing their life savings to just vanish into thin air.
And by 1923, this theoretical warning had become terrifyingly real, not just in Germany, but right across Central Europe. It wasn't just a political failure of reparations. It was the utter collapse of industrial capacity that went along with the monetary ruin.
The physical data on this is just staggering.
It confirms the devastation. The industrial lifeblood of the continent was draining away. Sources show that Europe's total coal production, which you need for industry, for transport, for everything, had fallen by a massive 30%.
I mean, if you can't fuel your factories or your trains, the entire basis of modern industrial civilization just grinds to a halt.
And the financial chaos was the inevitable result. Keynes points out that the wartime practices, financing the war by printing money, were continued afterward, either out of necessity or incompetence, as he puts it, and that led to this catastrophic post-war financial weakness.
And the German mark is the most visceral example of this, isn't it? This annihilation of value.
It's the classic example. Before the war, the mark was tied to gold. It exchanged at a par value of roughly 20 to the British pound. That gave you stability. Now fast forward to the aftermath. By March 1922, it had plummeted to over 1,000 to the pound.
1,000. That's a decline that in just a few years fundamentally wiped out the savings and the entire expected future of a generation.
It made any long-term contract, any financial planning, utterly impossible. This destruction wasn't marginal. It was absolute.
Okay, so the stage is set. We have Keynes, the insider-outsider, witnessing the fulfillment of his own darkest prophecy. And this brings us directly to the Tract on Monetary Reform, Chapter 1. This is where he moves from being the prophet of doom to the diagnostician.
Right. He's now explaining precisely how currency instability achieves this wholesale social destruction. And this opening chapter is just a foundational text. It blends this really sharp economic theory with profound social observation. He's trying to demystify that hidden force of economic law he talked about before.
Let's start with his core thesis then. The mechanism he identifies as the driver of all this instability. He cuts right to the chase, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He says the change in the value of money is important to society only insofar as its incidence is unequal.
This is the revolutionary insight of the chapter. It's so simple, but so powerful. If we lived in some kind of fantasy world where money's value changed uniformly for every single person, those changes would be irrelevant.
Right. Like imagine if overnight the value of the pound was cut in half, but at the exact same moment, Every price, every debt, every salary, and every bank account instantly doubled in number.
Exactly. You'd pay twice as much for milk, but you earn twice as much, and your savings account has twice as many pounds in it. There's no real effect on your purchasing power.
But that uniform change is just a complete theoretical fantasy, isn't it? The reason we face these vastest social consequences is because the incidence of monetary change is never, ever equal.
Never. Because money is the unit we use to make long-term contracts. A fixed debt, a permanent lease, a life annuity. And when that unit shifts in value, some people become incredibly wealthy, and other people are ruined.
Through no fault of their own.
Through no fault of their own. And this leads to his primary policy motivation. For Keynes, managing the currency wasn't just some economic tweak. It was a societal defense. By pushing for a consciously controlled, stable currency, he believed he was defending the core structure of capitalism.
Against what?
Against the inevitable attacks and criticism of socialist and communist innovators. He felt that instability, this arbitrary chaos, was the single best recruiting tool for revolutionaries.
So to understand this arbitrary redistribution of wealth, he gives us a framework, a triple classification of society.
Yes. He separates the entire propertied class, noting that the 19th century had already distinguished between the businessmen, so the active controllers of industry, and the investors, the passive holders of fixed financial claims.
Okay, so let's dive into that. Who takes the first hit?
We begin with the most obvious and really the most tragic victims of inflation, the investing class.
And who exactly falls into this category for Keynes back in 1923?
This is the rentier class, or really anyone relying on income from fixed financial claims. So this includes holders of leases and mortgages, but critically, holders of permanent loans to governments.
So government bond.
Government bonds. This was the backbone of the conservative, respectable middle class in the 19th century. People who saved their money, bought bonds, and expected a safe, steady retirement income because they trusted the stability of the state's currency.
And what does inflation do to them?
Inflation acts as a silent, invisible confiscation of their wealth. Because their capital and their income are fixed in nominal money terms, every percentage point of inflation is a percentage point reduction in their real purchasing power.
So it just eats away at them.
It systematically destroys the stable, trusting, saving middle class. It undermines the very concept of responsible long-term saving. Why bother if the government is just going to inflate it away?
To really bring this home, let's use the concrete example Keynes provided. It focused on the iconic investment of the British middle class, consols.
That example is just devastating. Consols are perpetual British government bonds. They pay a fixed amount of money forever. They were the classic, low-risk, trustworthy security.
The safest thing you could possibly own.
Supposedly. Keynes calculated that a holder of consols in 1922 had a real income, what they could actually buy with that money. That was only half of what they received in 1914. Their purchasing power was halved in less than a decade of war and post-war inflation.
Just think about the societal shock of that. You put your life savings into what is supposed to be the safest investment in the world, government debt, and the government, through its own monetary decisions, unilaterally wipes out half of your income.
And it gets even darker if you look back further, which Keynes did. That same investor's real income in 1922 was just 1/3 of what they had been enjoying in 1896.
1/3.
1/3. This isn't just a wartime dip. This is the effective obliteration of the financial progress of an entire generation. All the work, the saving, the financial prudence of an entire century negated by shifting monetary policy. The stable foundation of Victorian society was being quietly wiped out.
And when the investor is systematically ruined, that profound destruction, it naturally creates immense social bitterness, which then has to find a target.
It does, and that target is the second class Keynes examines, the business class, or the entrepreneurs.
Now, the business class, Keynes notes, is the active and constructive element in the whole capitalist society. They're the drivers of growth, the manufacturers, the traders, but inflation turns them into spectacular, undeserved winners.
Often accidentally.
Can you walk us through the actual mechanism of those windfall profits? Why does a trader inevitably make a bunch of money when prices are rising quickly?
It's really a matter of timing and velocity. A merchant buys raw materials or stock today for, say, 100 pounds. Inflation means that by the time they sell the finished product a month later, the general price level has increased by 10%.
So they sell the product for more.
They sell it for 115. They made a profit of £15 on their actual effort, plus an extra £10 in windfall profit, simply because the cost to replace their stock has gone up. They basically sold inventory they acquired with yesterday's more valuable money for today's depreciated money.
So they get rich quickly. And not necessarily because they invented a brilliant new product or managed their company well, but because the unit of measurement, the money, is shrinking underneath their balance sheet.
That's it, exactly. The system rewards them for possessing stock rather than for ingenious production. And this is the source of intense social friction. The public sees the cost of living skyrocketing. They see the businessmen getting visibly, quickly rich, and the popular indignation just boils over.
And this is where Keynes just nails the government's role in fracturing the social contract. The governments, who are often the primary cause of the inflation in the first place by printing money to cover their debts, they then seek to redirect that public anger.
Precisely. They scapegoat the winners. Governments label these individuals profiteers, painting them as greedy villains who somehow caused the inflation themselves.
So they deflect blame.
It's pure deflection. And in doing so, it damages the social reputation and the moral standing of the entire entrepreneurial class, the very people capitalism needs to function. The system turns its most active drivers into social pariahs, even though they were just benefiting from a monetary environment the state itself created.
It's a cycle of self-destruction. The prudent savers are ruined, and the productive entrepreneurs are vilified. So that brings us to the third group, the earner, or the working class.
The workers are, they're in a difficult spot. They're suffering from rising prices, but Keynes notes they tend to fare better than the rentiers during an inflation.
Why is that?
Because wages, even though they lag behind prices, are negotiated. And there's often institutional pressure from trade unions, which means that adjustments eventually happen. It allows the worker to maintain their real purchasing power a bit better than those people who are stuck on perfectly fixed claims.
Now, this is a crucial pivot point in the tract. Keynes argues that while inflation is the investor's enemy, deflation is the worker's great danger. Why does he draw this distinction? Why is deflation the more immediate social threat?
This is the absolute core of the policy trade-off facing Britain in the 1920s. Deflation was the policy required to restore the pound to its pre-war gold parity. To do that, you have to raise the value of your currency relative to other goods.
Okay, and raising the value of the currency requires an offsetting reduction in costs across the entire economy.
Right. And since labor represents a massive percentage of overall costs, especially in non-traded goods, that cost reduction, as Keynes argued, could only be brought about by a further rise in unemployment.
The mechanism is brutal, but it's simple.
It is. If Britain decides its currency is suddenly worth 10% more on the international stage, domestic producers have to cut their prices by 10% just to stay competitive in global markets. Since the costs of their imported raw materials or their interest payments might be relatively fixed, the only flexible cost left to cut is labor.
And if workers and their trade unions resist wage cuts, which of course they always do, the cheapest and fastest way for an employer to cut their labor cost is just to cut the workforce.
Hence, mass unemployment.
And Keynes clearly recognized that the modern industrial economy of 1923 was stiff. It wasn't the flexible, self-adjusting market that you read about in classical economic textbooks. He highlighted these institutional rigidities that made wage adjustment, as he put it, deplorably inelastic.
He did. He pointed to two key factors specific to modern industrial organization. First, the political and bargaining power of trade unions, which acted very strongly to prevent the cutting of pay rates by competition from unemployed workers. The unions basically stopped the price of labor from falling to clear the market.
And the second factor, the one that was perhaps most controversial at the time, was the dole.
Yes, the existence of the dole, or unemployment benefit, fundamentally changed the bargaining dynamic. It reduced, in his words, the extreme pressure to find employment elsewhere.
I mean, if you're a desperate, starving man, you'll accept any wage cut offered.
Of course. But if you have the dole, you have a buffer. You can hold out longer for a fair wage. Now, that's socially desirable for the individual worker, but it makes the economy-wide cost adjustment, that deflationary push, infinitely more difficult to achieve.
So forcing deflation onto this rigid system didn't lead to stable, lower prices. It led directly to the social devastation of mass unemployment. This is the profound difference, isn't it? The rentier loses their capital silently over time, but the worker loses their job visibly and immediately, sparking instant social unrest.
And this exhaustive analysis of the three societal classes and how they react so differently to monetary policy, it leads Keynes to his final, profound moral and pragmatic verdict in Chapter 1 of the Tract.
He boils down the entire policy choice to two stunningly succinct definitions. Inflation, he says, is fundamentally unjust, but deflation is fundamentally inexpedient.
It's a brilliant summary of the dilemma.
Wait, let's unpack that. If inflation wipes out the savings of the middle class, the prudent, the deserving, and just hands it over to accidental profiteers, isn't that a massive moral failure? How could he possibly suggest that deflation, which is merely inexpedient, is the potentially worse outcome? That sounds like a purely cold utilitarian calculation.
And that's where Keynes' political pragmatism just shines through. He is absolutely clear that inflation is morally unjust. It arbitrarily confiscates property, it destroys trust in the financial system, it is effectively a theft committed by the state.
Right.
But injustice, especially an invisible injustice like the slow erosion of a fixed annuity, is often abstract and diffuse. People feel it, but it's hard to organize around.
Mass unemployment is not abstract, it's concrete.
Precisely. Deflation, while perhaps morally neutral in terms of property transfer, is intensely inexpedient because it creates mass, visible, immediate suffering and unemployment, which leads directly to political catastrophe. His experience in the post-war years had shown him that the deliberate policy of deflation needed to get back to the pre-war gold parity risked triggering mass, prolonged unemployment.
And Keynes believed that that consequence mass joblessness was more immediately destabilizing to the social and economic order, and therefore more dangerous, than the quiet, unjust confiscation caused by inflation. When you have legions of unemployed workers on the streets, that's when you risk those convulsions of revolution he warned about.
So his opposition to the deflationary path was deeply pragmatic. Forcing up the value of the pound meant making British goods more expensive for foreigners, which is hardly a strategy to cure unemployment, is it? The level of wage and cost reduction required would entail just unacceptable, politically explosive social misery.
And this brings us back to his revolutionary central policy push in 1923, which just flew in the face of all the conventional wisdom of the London financial establishment at the time.
His urgent message was that managing domestic prices, so stabilizing the purchasing power of the pound inside Britain, would be impossibly difficult if Britain simultaneously tried to return to the rigid demands of the pre-war gold standard, which prioritized fixed exchange rates.
So for the first time, really, Keynes argued that domestic price stability must come before exchange stability.
That was a radical shift. The old doctrine held that the external value of the currency, its tie to gold, was sacred. Keynes was arguing that the internal stability of the economy jobs, predictable prices, was far more important than some technical return to a pre-war exchange rate.
He was essentially telling the government, protect your own citizens first, worry about gold later.
Indeed. It forced the reader to confront the ethical and social dimensions of monetary policy. The core lesson of Chapter 1 is that unstable money, whether it's unjust inflation or inexpedient deflation, shatters that implicit social contract.
By arbitrarily pitting the investor against the entrepreneur and the worker against the entire system, you sow the seeds of revolution and internal decay.
Keynes' ultimate goal was profound. He wasn't just trying to fix a balance sheet. He was attempting to invent, in his words, new wisdom for a new age, to stabilize the value of money, which he saw as the essential requirement to save the central structure of capitalism from the internal rot of injustice and the external threat of radical reformers.
So he spent this entire deep dive carefully laying out the effects of monetary instability on society, using Keynes' threefold diagnosis. Is a powerful argument for why monetary management is so necessary.
It is, but that's only half the story.
Exactly. Next time, we have to look at the other side of the equation. The cause. Why do governments, knowing these terrible social consequences, still resort to policies that debauch the currency?
So in episode 2 of our series on a tract on monetary reform, we're going to turn to Chapter 2 to discover precisely the political and fiscal pressures that force governments toward instability. We'll explore Keynes' striking analysis of inflation as a tax.
And we'll delve into the unsettling realization that some governments, like the Soviet government at the time, already viewed monetary inflation, quite frankly, as a conscious instrument of taxation, a stealthy way to extract wealth from the population without raising official tax rates.
And we will tackle the monumental dilemma of public debt. We'll see how governments use currency depreciation as a subtle, silent mechanism to reduce the real burden of their immense internal liabilities that are fixed in money terms. Depreciation, as Keynes noted, offers the subtle assistance needed to balance ordinary budgets when the political will for painful, visible taxation is simply not there.
Join us next time for a deep dive into the political economy of monetary financing as we continue our examination of Keynes's 1923 masterwork.